Hi everyone, it's me, Eggleston here, and I wanted to talk today about Talia Gresham, the Gresham family, and their experience with cerebral palsy. So I'll just start off with how Talia's early life. She was born in Somerset, New Jersey, in a hospital named St. Peter's University Hospital, and it's a Rutgers affiliate hospital. And that's the same place where at 3 months old, Talia was actually diagnosed with spastic diplegia cerebral palsy. And that's a type of cerebral palsy we'll kind of get into more so later, but it mostly for her affected her legs and her feet, and she had to receive a lot of treatment, especially early in her life. She had to receive multiple surgeries for actually one at 3 years old, one at 5 years old, one at 8 years old, and one at 10 years old. And so this really dominated her earlier life, where she was just kind of in and out of surgeries quite a bit. She had a lot of occupational therapy and physical therapy that was partially provided by the school, partially not. And so she kind of had to go through a lot of that when she was younger, a lot of the surgeries. They did do a great job helping with her chronic pain, which we'll see is one of the big symptoms for especially her type of cerebral palsy. Um, and on top of that, she was not able to improve her locomotion as much as the doctors had hoped. So she was forced to go from crutches onto a wheelchair, which had its benefits. She was much more energetic because she didn't have to tire herself out so much on the crutches all the time. Instead, she was able to save her energy as she had an aide that was able to push her wheelchair and carry her bag for her. And so that kind of made it a lot easier to focus on really just her academic work and being a child as opposed to, worrying about like, oh God, do I even have the energy to make it to my next class? And so she was transitioned to a wheelchair, which also had some negative effects. She it took a hit on her social life where all of a sudden kind of a lot of the social opportunities seemed to be drying up, and Miss Gresham kind of attributes that to people just didn't want to have to, as they saw, bother having to accommodate Talia. It was going to be too much of an ask, it was going to be too difficult. So a lot of that kind of just dried up for her, and it made socializing difficult for a period. But the Gresham family are a fantastic family. Tracy Gresham is the mother. She's a single mother with 3 kids. She did a great job raising all of them. Kwan is the eldest at 35. You've got Tinka at 27, and then you've got Talia at 24. And she pretty much raised all 3 of her kids all by herself, which was also good when she got to Talia because she did have a lot of experience in parenting. So she was able to kind of have a wrap on a lot of the things when she was trying to transition Talia to college or work on the IEPs. These were all, she already had a lot of experience in parenting, so it wasn't as intimidating as an ordeal to have to deal with. And she also, the Quan, he's kind of been out of the house for quite a while. He's quite a bit older, so Talia and him aren't quite as close. But Tinka and Talia are practically inseparable. They're very, very supportive of each other. Tinka was especially supportive when Talia was facing a bit of isolation, and that was really helpful to Talia's confidence at the time. But anyway, Talia went to Franklin Township School District, and that's a school district that encompasses Somerset among other towns. And it's a very, very big school district, and it's great with accommodations. Talia had an aide who carried her bags, she wrote her notes for her, and she pushed her wheelchair for her. On top of that, Talia was given an extra amount of time to complete quizzes and tests. She was given 1.5 times the period, and later it was actually bumped up to 2 times the regular testing time parameters. On top of that, the school did give her occupational therapy in class, and that was mostly dealing with buttoning buttons, tying shoes, a lot of fine motor skills that Talia had a bit of trouble with, especially early in life. She also had different gym workouts when she was at the school. So instead of partaking in like a lot of the team sports that she couldn't, she instead was able to like lift weights and stuff, which Miss Gresham says definitely helped with her strength, which is very big when you've got to push your own wheelchair, even if you do have an aid there. And so, speaking of the aids, she had two different aids throughout her schooling, and these aids were really helpful. They were very perceptive, they were very open, as was the entire IEP team for Miss Gresham. And so, anytime there was an issue or a concern, they always addressed it very quickly. One of the main concerns that they had was with her time. As I mentioned before, she was bumped up from 1.5 times to 2 times the regular test period. And that was because Miss Gresham was worried about Talia. She didn't think Talia had enough time to really put as good work as she wanted. Instead, she was kind of worried instead of the substance of the test on just completing it at all. And on top of, so that was very helpful. And on top of that, when Talia wanted a bit more independence in high school, they were more than happy to give it to her. They pulled back completely. The aide no longer pushed her wheelchair. The aide no longer wrote notes for her, and she also was able to kind of just carry her own bag. So she was pretty much becoming her own woman, which was incredibly helpful when you're talking about someone who's going and looking to transition into college, where you're going to have to be a lot more individualistic. So it was really helpful for her to kind of have the aide take a step back and help her fully transition. And so, anyway, we'll get into the cerebral palsy pathologies and the symptoms and the causes now. I'll just start with the symptoms. It's an incredibly broad group of disorders, we're going to have to spend quite a lot of time just kind of breaking down the different types of cerebral palsy, but we'll start with some of the basic symptoms. Some of the basic things include impaired movement. Now, this is about as vague as it can get, and we're going to see there's a lot of different types of movement that can be affected by cerebral palsy. But we're talking a lot of times it can be like spastic movements, as seen with spastic cerebral palsies that we'll get into, where you have tightened muscles as opposed to loosened muscles, which you can also have. You can also have a lot of difficulties with like balancing, fine motor movements, and plenty of other kind of musculature issues. Really, as a neuromuscular disorder, there are so many different modes that it can affect you by. Also, you can have speech issues. So with speech issues, because it's a neuromuscular disease, it can also affect your face. So if your face muscles are affected, it's going to be harder to just, develop your speech and to maybe not slur as well and kind of have very clear speaking. On top of that, like I've mentioned before, there's a lot of muscle tendon issues that can kind of come from the tightness. And what that is really a big part of, though, is a lot of the chronic pain that a lot of people suffer. A lot of that chronic pain, not always, but a lot of it does have to do with the muscle and tendon tightness that we're going to see from the spastic cerebral palsies. Also, you can have neurological issues that come along with it. It's not just neuromuscular, there are also neurological components. And some of those, there are intellectual disabilities that are associated. You can have epilepsy also associated with it and have seizures. Like we were saying with the facial muscles, it can affect your like speech and sight and visions and hearing. Also on the neurological aspect, it can also affect those. So it doesn't just have to be a symptom of the musculature in your face. It can also just be the neurological connections. And so obviously there's quite a bit of variety in the symptomology. As we're going to see, there's also quite a bit of variety in the causes. So a lot of the causes we're seeing, one of the less understood ones are the genetic factors. So obviously we need a lot more research done just on the genome in general and kind of battening down where different genetic components come from in the human genome. And so we don't really understand what affects cerebral palsy in the genome, in the parents. We're still, more research is needed on that aspect. But there are a lot more concrete causes that we are aware of, and a lot of these have to do with the fetus. If, say, you have an infection while you're pregnant, or the baby also gets some kind of viral infection or something, that can have a that can have a neurological issue. And also on top of that, there can be fetal strokes, there can be fetal hemorrhages, traumatic brain injuries, essentially concussions, and also one of the lesser accepted ones now. It still definitely can play a factor, but it used to be thought of as like one of the more ubiquitous causes, but that's labor asphyxiation. And that one, like I said, it's kind of been pushed to the side a little bit more than the other causes, which we've seen to kind of take a bigger role in what causes cerebral palsy as opposed to the labor asphyxiation. It's a less popular answer at this time. So the types of cerebral palsy, there's plenty of types. I'm just going to start by talking about spastic cerebral palsy. And so spastic cerebral palsy is a type, it's 80% of the cases of cerebral palsy actually, so it's a vast, vast majority of them. And one of the signatures of spastic cerebral palsy is the increased muscle tone. It'll be too tightly bound. That's what the increased tone means. It's too tight, it's too short. And so that, like I said, it causes a lot of chronic pain and locomotion issues. And so in spastic cerebral palsy, there are multiple different subcategories. The first subcategory is going to be spastic diplegia. This is the type that Talia has. She has spastic diplegia, and this affects her legs. Mostly, it's on the lower extremities, and like I said, it mostly has to do with the increased muscle tone of what makes this one, the spastic diplegia, separate from all of the other types of cerebral palsy because it affects the legs and it's the increased muscle tone. With spastic hemiplegia, that's the next type of spastic cerebral palsy. Spastic hemiplegia has to usually affect just one side of the body, if you think. And it usually affects the upper body more so, like the arms, those extremities, as opposed to the legs. And so it usually affects one limb more so than the two limbs of diplegia. And then we go on to what's seen as the most severe of the spastic cerebral palsies, and that's spastic quadriplegia. Spastic quadriplegia, if you could guess by the quad, it affects all four limbs, but it doesn't just affect the limbs. It also affects the torso and the facial muscles, and it's often associated with also a lot of the other severe pathologies in cerebral palsy. We're talking intellectual disabilities, epilepsy and seizures, and it can even affect like your vision, hearing, and speech. And that's because this one, with affecting your face, it's also affecting the neuromusculature of your, sensory organs. So your eyes, your ears, they might not perform optimally on a musculature and a neurological level. And the speech neuromuscularly can also be kind of inhibited. So, off of the spastic cerebral palsy types, on to the dyskinetic cerebral palsy. Now, dyskinetic cerebral palsy is a type where it has partial of the spastic, but it also has a other half of it, where you can have the muscles and tendons that are much too tight and affecting you that way. But dyskinetic cerebral palsy also has a part of it where the muscles actually switch from too tight to being too loose. So we're talking about kind of like a moment to moment change that can happen just in your neuromuscularity, where all of a sudden you go from having very, very tight, painful muscles where you have spastic movements to all of a sudden you have very loose muscles where you can't balance quite as well because your muscles aren't contracting as quickly as they should. So it just takes like that split second longer that it takes for your muscles to contract can completely throw off your balance and your fine motor movement. And so that's what you see in dyskinetic cerebral palsy is you see it switching between those two phases. And then you also have ataxic cerebral palsy, which has a very similar component to dyskinetic, and the opposite to spastic, where ataxic actually deals with the looseness of the muscles and tendons. Ataxic has very loose muscle tendons, and that shows itself in the symptomology. The symptomology often has to do with poor balance and coordination, trouble with like quick movements, like I was saying, that the slower, just a split second slower in the musculature movement will completely throw off your balance and your fine motor skills, and so that's a lot of what ataxic cerebral palsy, what makes it unique, is that loosening of the muscles and the tendons. And then finally, we have mixed cerebral palsy, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It's just a mix of two of the different types. The most common is dyskinetic cerebral palsy, along with one of the forms of spastic, usually spastic diplegia. And so it'll be a mix of those where with dyskinetic, like I was saying, you have the switch between too tight and too loose, and then with spastic you also have too tight. And so you can have multiple different presentations of cerebral palsy because it is such a varied spectrum of disorders. And so Talia specifically, she had spastic diplegia, one of the more common presentations. And so her legs were affected primarily. She has bowing of her legs where they go inwards like this. It hurts quite a bit. The chronic pain associated is quite severe. And also the locomotion is inhibited by the bowing of the legs. And that has to do with because her muscles are like so tight, it's kind of like turning them inwards almost. And with that, she also had delayed speech, which was pretty difficult for her to overcome. She only started speaking when she was 4 years old. And so, especially when you're entering school and stuff, it's going to be hard when you're that far behind speech wise. But she was very intelligent and she was able to learn her speech pretty quickly. And so it didn't really hold her back as much as maybe the surgeries held her back a little bit more just from missing school. So anyway, there are a lot of different ways to assist people and accommodate people who have cerebral palsy. And so I just wanted to share a few of the things that I found that could be helpful. The first one is what's called a power assist for a wheelchair. It's a type of like thing. It's like a wheel that you attach to the back of it that has a motor in it. And so you can get multiple types. Some like you push and it just maintains your speed. Some can like completely control your wheelchair like an electric wheelchair. But this can often be an easier option than having an electric wheelchair. Because the electric wheelchair, obviously, it's not nearly as compact. With Talia, she had one of the foldable, a very nice one, but a foldable wheelchair, so that she could kind of take it to and from if she had to be driven by someone who didn't have like the accommodations for like a handicap accessible van. So she was able to just hop in anyone's car, but she was still able to get the benefit of having a functional power assist. Yet hers was a very, very early version, or at least like not a great version, because now I've found ones where you can literally just control it like it's an electric wheelchair. They give you like a little watch thing or a little control panel, and so you can pretty much completely pretend like it's an electric wheelchair, but you also get the benefits of having like a foldable, easier to deal with, lighter wheelchair. So I think that's really helpful because, like I said, one of the big things with Talia was that she was always exhausted. And while that was helped when she got in the wheelchair, a lot of the energy was saved because she had an aide pushing her around for so long. So this could be really helpful in just kind of saving someone's energy. On top of that, we also have a slanted writing board. And so this is something that's just a little more ergonomic. It's just, you're putting your wrists on a more ergonomic slant. And what this does for people with fine motor skill issues is that it can actually, it helps with the ergonomics, it helps with their fatigue in their hands. If you've got pain in your hands, it can greatly help, and so it helps you write faster and longer, essentially, just by being a bit more ergonomic. And so this is incredibly helpful for people like Talia. She never actually used one, but talking to Miss Gresham and stuff, she said that something like this would be great, and it's only like you can. I found them for $15 on Walmart. Very ubiquitous, and that's my entire story of Talia and her journey and the Gresham's journey with cerebral palsy. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed.